just think the way in which this whole environment has become about criticizing people as opposed to encouraging people is against all the rules of ending wars.
Let's talk to someone who has negotiated with the Russians and the Ukrainians pretty recently. His name is Martin Griffiths. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Victoria. Good to be with you.
You are a former British diplomat. You are a mediation specialist. You've worked for many years at the United Nations. You stepped down last year as Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the UN. And really key for our conversation today, you played a vital role in negotiating the Black Sea grain deal. Your assessment of how the current talks are going?
It's not a sort of masterclass in mediation, obviously. And my experience of mediation, which crosses continents, including, as you say, in this context, is you shut up instead of talking publicly about where we're going, precisely because the concessions that are always needed in any negotiation, political, commercial, humanitarian, and so forth, need to be done in a safe environment and then prepared for the public accountability. So I'm a bit dismayed at the public diplomacy that's going on, but I'm also quite admiring of the way in which the US has really picked up the energy to get this right. You know, they're meeting day and night in Saudi Arabia. Soon Witkoff, I think, is in Russia. You know, and so that's really good because what you want at this stage, early stage, is energy.
We've got a picture of you meeting Sergei Lavrov in Moscow and various other dignitaries. This was April 2022. Just give us an insight, describe for our listeners what it's like when you're sitting around that table.
Victoria, I remember it so well, which is, you know, striking actually, because this meeting happens all the time. Lavrov was a minister that I have admired actually for decades because he was in the mission in New York under Kofi Annan, and he was an extraordinary player. And at this point, in that meeting, and he'd had an earlier meeting with Guterres, by the way, which set up the whole process for doing this stuff, including in Azovstal, where Guterres had been quite critical of him. And in this case, he was laughing, but also criticizing my naivety, which I think is sort of not unusual. So, you know, why should we do that? What about this? You know, we're the soldiers, and what do we gain? And what about Ukraine and their horrible fascism? All this stuff that we've heard elsewhere. So it wasn't an exactly constructive meeting, but it was a sort of laying off the hands, I think, on each other. And I then went from there. It was fine. I didn't mind. I mean, I then went from there to deal very, very closely with his deputy, Sergei Vershinin, who I've known for a very long time. And we made some progress. Yes. I don't think Lavrov at that meeting was interested in progress.
You say you admire Lavrov. Do you think he negotiated in good faith then? Do you think Russia is negotiating in good faith now?
I worry about that a lot. You know, what we had in the Black Sea mediation, which started around the time of that meeting that Victoria was mentioning, went through to the July signing in Istanbul and on to the next year, was a complicated negotiation. Obviously, Kyiv on the one side, and I had been involved in the Azovstal and Mariupol operation with Kyiv, and frankly, also with the Russian military leadership, who allowed the process to work. And then the problem was that when it came to something a little bit less military and a little bit more political, the foreign ministry intervened. We had a very good relationship with the defense ministry. There was a certain rivalry about that in Moscow. And Minister Lavrov and his officials were suspicious, in a way, of what they might be giving away. So we had an uphill battle to come back from the defense ministry to say, actually, this is, we hope, good for Russia. I don't know if that worked. I think what was very clear was that the Kremlin was behind every single decision. This is no surprise, is it? President Putin was all over this, and we had ways to get contact with him as well. And so we were witnessing a sense of the balls moving in Moscow as to which power base would be important. And what the challenge for me was, don't get involved in these dynamics. Stay clear, stay neutral, stay distant. I think it worked, until it didn't.
But what does it tell us about the future of any negotiations? The Americans are they seem to be enraptured by Russia, critical of Ukraine, and some of the statements that we've heard from the administration are simply not true. Does that give us any hope that this is going to end anytime soon through diplomacy?
It doesn't help, does it? Vitaly? I get that. What you're trying to do is shut up instead of have an international conversation about what's going on in the doors behind you. You should be impartial. That's the whole principle of mediation, for goodness sake. Of course, you have your interests, but you should be impartial and neutral about engaging with the parties. And perhaps more importantly to your question, you should actually attend to the conditions or positions, to correct myself, which are likely to make the end of war, the ceasefire and beyond, likely. What we know, what I know personally in many places, is that most ceasefires end. The level of success of ceasefires is very, very, difficult. Now, I'm very pleased in this context that the US and others have focused a lot recently, not before, on saying we need to look carefully and negotiate now on the outcomes.